Hello, everyone, and welcome to Being Frank, where the only way to be is frank. I'm your host, Frank LoBuono. We want to thank you for joining us here on the Intelligent Conversation podcast. We're live with a new show every week. This week, no exception. We're going live tonight, the 15th of December, here at HudsonRiverRadio.com, which comes from historic Stony Point, New York, where Neil Richter is our engineer. As I like to tease him, he drives the bus for us. But remember, you can also catch us wherever you get your favorite podcasts. That includes Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, etc. And remember, even though we go live to tape, we are archived, so you can catch us at your convenience at any one of those locations. Okay, if you care to see us, we have a Facebook page that is HudsonRiverRadio.com or Hudson River Radio. Go to Facebook. Okay, you can watch us there, or you can go to a link that we have on the Facebook page for Twitch TV, and you can catch us there. We also ask you to become a subscriber wherever, again, you listen to it. You can do it at Hudson River Radio, Apple TV, wherever you listen to your podcast. Become a subscriber, and we'll be there for you. Okay, we call it the Intelligent Conversation Podcast because that's what we're all about. And my guest this evening, as a frequent contributor here at Being Frank, I call him my media guy, my go-to media guy. He is a Renaissance man, I like to call him, because he does so much. He's a singer, he's a songwriter, he's also a professor at media and communication studies, and my colleague at Fordham University. He's also an expert on the First Amendment, and that's why we have him here this evening. Please welcome Dr. Paul Levinson. Paul, thank you so much for joining us once again.
Well, it's great to be back here with you, Frank.
Paul, as most people know, after a long, protracted battle, Elon Musk finally managed to purchase Twitter. And during that time, he has tried to portray himself as this great champion, a bastion of free speech. But that may not be entirely true. That's his version of what he would like people to know. I don't know if we necessarily agree. And according to an article that you just wrote for NBC News, an opinion article titled "How Elon Musk is Complicating America's Understanding of Free Speech," as this Twitter files debacle highlighted, Musk is fronting an attractive sounding crusade, especially for the right. But does free speech really need saving? Let's take it from there, Paul. There's a lot packed into that into that headline. Forgive me. Let's unpack it a little bit. What do you mean by that? Again, a lot said in a few sentences.
Well, first of all, free speech always does need protection, because there seem to be an almost infinite number of people who want to cut out a lot of speech. And, when we're talking about free speech, we're talking really about communication in general. It doesn't matter whether it's the spoken word, the printed word, the word on a screen, an image. All of those are forms of communication. And under our First Amendment, the government, first of all, in the first place, the federal government, but then through the 14th Amendment, not only the federal government, but any state government or local government, none of those governments are allowed to get in the way of communication unless the communication poses a threat to human life. And we can get into that in more detail in a few minutes, but it's not an absolute right. I mean, just to give you one very obvious example, the First Amendment was never intended to protect a group of criminals plotting to go out and kill a bunch of people. As a matter of fact, we want our government to stop that from happening. And if they uncover such a plot, we expect our government to keep track of it and do whatever is necessary to protect the lives of its citizens. But other than that, everything is off limits for government control. Now, in contrast, a private organization And even if it's a corporation that's publicly owned, they can pretty much say and do whatever they please. Again, as long as what they're doing is not coddling a group of people who are trying to mete out harm and even death to other human beings. So good for Elon Musk that he says he's a great champion of the First Amendment. The First Amendment needs champions, but unfortunately, a lot of what he's done is just a lot of smoke and mirrors, and it has really nothing to do with the First Amendment. So these Twitter files,
Yeah,
they
don't
were.
forget to that. These so-called, we hear it all over the place, the Twitter files.
That's
What
right.
are the Twitter files? What are they? Do they have any value to us at all? Please develop that.
Well, this is another MAGA right-wing obsession telling the American people they think the truth about Hunter Biden. And of course, they're not stupid when they want to do that. These MAGA Republicans and all of their adherents, because clearly Joe Biden as a human being has been through an enormous amount of tragedy in his life. Nobody would want to go through what he's gone through. And Hunter Biden is his one surviving son. And he's had some problems in his life. And Musk began saying, you know what, I discovered that Twitter did not make public these files about Hunter Biden. And so with a lot of fanfare, and that's what got me interested, Musk released those files. And in the first place, again, Twitter, before Musk, had every right not to release those files because, again, they weren't the government. They have every right to decide what goes on their system and what doesn't. And so Musk released these files, and basically they were almost nonsensical. Some naked pictures of Hunter Biden. Frankly, I didn't even look at the files when I heard what they were. But this is the kind of grandiose nonsense that Musk all too often is involved with. So the First Amendment doesn't need that kind of protection. Who cares about the Hunter Biden files? I don't care whether Twitter or anyone decides not to publish them, nor, by the way, is anyone saying it would be illegal for any organization to publish them. But instead of focusing on important things, for example, the damage that misinformation about COVID has done to human beings, that's something that actually Musk himself, before he bought Twitter, was very frequently participating in. I mean, I was horrified, and I cite some of these in my article. Musk basically almost week after week in the early days of the COVID crisis publicize some other insane policy, complete nonsense, ranging from hydrochloroquine is going to help us get over Twitter. By the way, this was something that organizations, even the New York Times, mistakenly gave too much publicity to this. But the fact is, Musk, even much more than the New York Times, would go on and say, hey, you should check this out. This is very important. He published information that kids are not affected by the pandemic, that it would be over pretty soon, that anyone, I mean, we've heard that from Trump and many other people, that anyone who was really upset about the pandemic, well, that was just dumb. That's a direct quote. So he was a font of misinformation about Twitter, misinformation that, if anyone believed it, could have gotten them really sick and indeed cost them their lives. So he's now CEO of this company that he purchased with all his money. And he just announced a couple of weeks ago he was going to do away with the restrictions that the previous owners of Twitter very wisely put on this kind of misinformation. And again, this is not the First Amendment. the First Amendment is not saying, hey, if there's a pandemic and you have information that no doctor, no legitimate authority supports, and if people follow this information, they may well die. The First Amendment isn't saying it's perfectly okay for that to be publicized everywhere and anywhere. And numerous Supreme Court decisions have made that limitation on free expression very clear. Musk apparently doesn't care about that.
Well, you used within there, within your article too, very cleverly put, where you may be entitled to your own opinion, but not your own facts. And I think that's what applies here. But is it the company's responsibility or the readers, the digesters, if you will, of such information? What responsibility do we have to realize that these things are false? Because there is a fine line, and I know you are a champion of the First Amendment, that freedom of speech is not for speech alike. It was literally created for people for speech you don't like, because that also needs to be heard. But there's that fine line. Who I guess my point is, Paul, who's the ultimate arbiter of such things? Then there has to be. Is it us? Is it them? And who is them? And you can't necessarily see me if you're listening, but I'm using the quotation mark hand signal. Who is the arbiter of that?
Well, ultimately, every human being, assuming we're not talking about a 3-month-old or a 4-year-old human being, but every cognizant human being, every human being who is able to reason. And by the way, Jean Piaget, the famous child psychologist, conclusively showed over 50 years ago that pretty much at the age of puberty, kids are capable of adult reasoning. So if you have to put a specific number on the age of a child, it's someone in their early teens and over. Ultimately, those people, including us, of course, because we're far older than that, it's on us if we make a decision that winds up hurting us or members of our family because we believe something that is so dangerous, like this misinformation about COVID. But we do have a government that we expect us to do the best it can in situations in which there is a deadly pandemic at large, or in situations in which people are upset about the results of the election. We expect our government to not allow communication that, again, is not an opinion, but is just a blatant misstatement of fact, and thereby stirs up people to violence, like the attack on the Capitol in January 2021, or winds up getting us more victims to this deadly pandemic. And, it's not that hard to understand the difference between opinions and facts. I could say, for example, I don't agree with this, but I could say, you know what? I think rich people should not be taxed at all. I'm sure Elon Musk would be happy to hear that opinion, because when they earn more money and have more money, that money trickles down to everyone in the population. This is like classic capitalism. I could say that. That's my opinion. No one under the First Amendment, or just anyone who has a sense of fairness and equity, nobody should be permitted to prevent someone else from saying that. That's the essence of free expression. So even though I disagree vehemently with that point of view, I think the richer you are, the more you should be taxed. But although I disagree with it, I strongly defend the right of anyone who has that opinion to publicize it. That's fine.
The Voltaire connection there, yes, please.
Yes. So that's the point. You have people, the right wing, and in response to that article that NBC think was good enough to publish, I've gotten dozens of emails. I don't know how these people find out my email, but I'm actually happy to respond to them if it's not too vulgar and vicious, which
Yes.
some of them are.
Oh, it's
But
amazing.
yeah, but I mean, they totally misunderstand the First Amendment. They think that anybody can say anything that they want, and if people die as a result of it, well, too bad. That's the First Amendment, but that's not the First Amendment. And I don't really know if Musk has the depth of understanding of the First Amendment to even get what you and I are just talking about. You understand it. I understand it. I have a feeling all of our listeners understand it. Musk apparently either doesn't understand that or doesn't want to understand that.
Well, let's talk about his procedure as journalists. You and I. He enlisted the help of hand-chosen journalists to go over these so-called files, including Matt Taibbi, who is respected in many circles, etc. But the fact that he handpicked them, does that make the study even more jaded? Did they find anything useful? Should they be proud of themselves as journalists for participating? Did they shake the establishment with what they found in these so-called Twitter files?
Well, I am surprised, frankly, that Matt Taibbi, having looked at what was then released to the public, told Musk that there was anything worthwhile in those files warranting this big buildup and release. And I have no problem. Musk can hire whomever he pleases to look at given material and advise him, is this worth releasing? Should it be released? So what I'm somewhat disappointed in is the judgment of the people that Musk hired, although I don't know, who knows what their private conversations were in any case. For all I know, some of these people did tell Musk, what are you wasting your time with this nonsense? That's what I would have told him. And Musk ignored their advice. He makes a big deal out of getting all this good advice, but then basically makes a somewhat ludicrous, laughable decision.
Well, here's one that we might file under, since we're dealing with files here. Ludicrous decision. It was discovered that the man who is not banning anything, it all goes, it's all good, decides to ban, there's some kind of app or something that tracks the movement of wealthy people's airplanes and yachts. I gather you and I and Neil are not on that list, so we're safe for now. Paul and Neil, I guess we're not. But to get back to the point, it was found that Musk had that removed, that app or removed from Twitter because it was dangerous, and it is. But the hypocrisy of saying, well, it's because it's dangerous to me, now it has to be removed. I mean, to me, that's the ultimate hypocrisy. You're talking out of both sides of your mouth. Your thoughts?
Well, no, you're absolutely right. And this gets back to the central point. Musk presents himself as an absolute champion, 100% of the First Amendment, even more than what the First Amendment says, even more than the way it's interpreted throughout hundreds of years in our courts. And Musk is saying anything and everything goes. And this, again, relatively laughable example. You're right, it is laughable. Of course, he doesn't want that information publicly available. Of course, it's private information. It's nobody's business. So, why then, on the one hand, present yourself as this knight in shining armor that's going to defend the First Amendment and everything be released, and then the first chance there's something that's embarrassing to him, then that's something that's not supposed to be permitted to get disseminated. And again, that violates this very fundamental principle of the First Amendment, designed not to protect speech that you love, but speech that you hate. So basically, he may hate that information. I don't blame him. You know, who wants that information available? And so therefore he doesn't want it on Twitter. He has every right, by the way, again, because he owns Twitter, he's not the government. He has every right to say, I don't want this app having anything to do with Twitter, but then don't present yourself as this wonderful champion that we've all been waiting for, liberating us and protecting the First Amendment, because clearly he's not doing anything like that.
Paul, I think it's perfect timing for that, and it really struck me from the article that you wrote. And by the way, it's available on my Facebook page. I'm public. I shared it with people. I highly recommend you read it. It's not a long read. It's excellent, gets right to the point. But I thought the final paragraph is worth reading and getting some comments from you, Paul, on it. It's just, and it really encapsulates what we're talking about. And this is the final paragraph of this article that Professor Paul Levinson wrote for NBC News. On the other hand, free speech does not mean the total lack of limits. A criminal conspiracy organized online would be an appropriate and necessary target of government intervention and prosecution. And here's the famous line: falsely shouting fire in a crowded theater, the famous example offered by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. in the Supreme Court's 1919 Schenck versus United States, is rightly prohibited as well. If we agree that endangering human lives is a worthy reason to limit a given communication, then spreading lies and conspiracy theories about something as deadly as COVID-19 surely deserves government prohibition too. And I want to remind people that you are one of the staunchest defenders of the First Amendment, again, of true free speech. You don't have to like it, but you have to allow it on certain levels. Develop that a little bit more, exactly what you mean here, Paul.
Well, again, the First Amendment is designed and was designed to allow totally open political discourse, meaning no political opinion. And that's why I gave the example earlier about let's not tax millionaires and billionaires. That's an opinion that I don't agree with at all, but total laissez-faire capitalists. I'm sure some people, at least in the Republican Party, although I never understand why people who are struggling to make a living, I don't know why a single one of those people ever votes Republican, but that's just my opinion.
That's your opinion, and right. You're entitled to it, which point well taken, well made right there. He's entitled to say it here, folks, whether we agree with him or not. That's kind of the point. And we're defending his right to give his opinion here and now.
Yes, that's exactly right. And this is why the difference between opinions and facts are so important. And admittedly, you know, although the difference between an opinion and a fact is pretty obvious, sometimes in a given communication, they can be intertwined so deeply, it's hard to tell where one ends and the other begins. You know, for example, let's say you're talking about wearing masks, and let's say someone says, I don't think masks do any good. As a matter of fact, I know a lot of people who wore masks and they came down with COVID anyway. And also it makes me feel uncomfortable with masks, and no one should force me to wear a mask. So that statement that I just made, it has a little bit of something that seems like a fact. How many people did this person really know who wore masks, who came down with COVID? But other than that, that's just mostly opinion. People are entitled to say, I don't like wearing a mask. People are entitled to say, I feel uncomfortable wearing a mask. People are entitled to say, it crimps my style. You know, if I want to go out with someone and do something and we're both wearing masks, that's not as much fun as it was in the old days when you didn't have to worry about that. So most of that statement is an opinion, and mixed in there are a few facts, but by and large, that is something that needs to be permitted, because once you start saying nobody can express an opinion, that doesn't leave that much to communicate and talk about. And indeed, people should be allowed to express mistaken views of facts, as long as those facts don't endanger anyone's lives. So let's say I'm talking to someone who hates the New York Yankees, and they say, the New York Yankees, I don't see why you and so many other people love the Yankees. They've lost so many games, in the last 50 years, they've been in maybe 2 World Series. This is considered a great team. So there again, you have an opinion mixed in with a completely wrong piece of information. The New York Yankees have been in many more World Series than 2 or 3 in the last 50 years. But even that fact is permissible because no one's life is being endangered by the communication of that fact. It's not falsely shouting fire in a crowded theater, where the result of that lie could result in people being trampled. By the way, even in that situation, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that the best remedy is not even stopping people from shouting fire in a crowded theater. It's building theaters in which people can quickly get out of the theater and not trample one another if there is really a fire.
Well, that brings us in a perfect segue to our last topical point when each person feels they are in the right. And, I'm talking about a Supreme Court decision. I'm going to get into a little bit more detail. We have to take a brief station ID break. But when we come back, I want to get into that because I think it's really important, where one person says, well, it's my right to have it this way. And the other person is saying, well, it's my right not to give it to you that way. I want your feelings on that. We'll talk a little bit about that after the break. We'll remind everybody you're watching Being Frank, where the only way to be is frank. I'm your host, Frank LoBuono. My very special guest, Professor Paul Levinson. We'll be back with more right after this very brief message. Don't go anywhere.
This is HudsonRiverRadio.com. This is HudsonRiverRadio.com.
Wow, that was brief. Did you blink, Paul?
Yeah, well,
I was going to get a drink of water.
Me too. I was going to get a cup of coffee.
That's our new format. Anyway, more for us to talk about. Anyway, Paul, again, remind everybody, this is Being Frank. I'm your host, Frank LoBuono. Dr. Paul Levinson, a specialist in free speech, the First Amendment. He's a professor of communication and media arts and my colleague at Fordham University here in New York. And we're talking about the First Amendment. We've been talking an awful lot about Elon Musk, but there is another important decision that will be rendered shortly, probably sometime in the spring, before the Supreme Court, that involves a woman who designs websites. And a gay couple came to her to design a website for them and their business, and citing religious objections, the creator of the website refused to create the website for this gay couple. Very similar to, if you remember a few months ago, there was a situation with a baker, and the baker refused to bake a cake based on his First Amendment right to free speech. Making cakes was his artistic expression. Very similar here, very similar argument, where the woman says, this is my artistic expression. It's my First Amendment right to express my art the way I choose to, and in topics that I choose to work with, okay, versus another person, okay, who is experiencing discrimination simply because they're gay, and said, wait a minute, my money is good. It's as green as anybody else's. Why won't you make me this website? Now, if you remember in the previous one, this rather conservative court ruled in favor of the baker. So chances are, once again, if you're a betting man, that they will rule once again in favor of the website designer. But let's get into it in some detail, Professor. That's a tough one because you have two, and they're as you mentioned, they're legitimately entitled to their opinion. You know, you could say, oh, she's a religious fanatic. She's entitled to be a religious fanatic. That's what the First Amendment is. But then again, does that allow you the freedom to discriminate? Big big discussion here to close with, Paul.
Well, I'll tell you one thing. If that bakery were in the New York or Cape Cod area, I would never go into it. They wouldn't
I
get
think
my
it makes
business.
too much money in this area. Well, let's face it, I doubt it.
But look, you're right. This is really just from a philosophic and legal point of view a fascinating issue
Absolutely.
because it does pit two fundamental rights against each other. First of all, the First Amendment also talks about separation of church and state. And what that has always been interpreted as is the government should not favor one religion over another religion. So if there is a religious fundamentalist belief that somehow being gay is going against God's will, and you don't want to have any business with gay people, and you are following your religion, if you look at the First Amendment in terms of what it says about religion, the government should not go in and force anyone to do anything against their religion.
Right.
But and this is the important point. Let's get back again to endangering human lives. Let's say a person is part of a religion, and a fundamental aspect of their religion is like once every year just picking a person off the street, throwing them into a big pot and boiling them. That's their religion. Okay. Now, clearly, the government can't allow that free religious expression because, again, it's endangering human life. And what that clearly shows is that there are limits to what the government can tolerate and should tolerate under the banner of the government should keep its hands off religions, which gets us in turn, as you correctly said, to the strong sense that we have had in this country, not long enough, but thankfully better late than never, that everyone in this country should have equal rights. And so if a Black person walks into that bakery or wants a web page to be made, unless you are a white supremacist or a Nazi, and there are those people, again, they're entitled to their opinions, but again, they can't act in a way that discriminates and deprives certain people of their rights just because of the color of their skin. I think most Americans, I hope most Americans would think that is a correct analysis and interpretation. And if you look at it that way, and I think that is the correct way of looking at it, the same applies to a gay person. Why on earth should any business be permitted to discriminate against someone based on what that person's sexual proclivities are? I mean, it seems to me the only business that is of importance to are the people who are involved in the romantic relationship. Everybody else, too bad. You don't like it? Suck it up. You don't like designing a web page for a gay person? Then you maybe should get into a business where you don't have to provide services to gay people, which is exactly the same thing we would say to someone who refused to design a web page for a Black person or a Spanish person or an immigrant or a person who had some kind of disability. We have laws against that as well. And so I think in this case, although sadly, as you also correctly said, I won't be the least surprised if the Supreme Court makes another atrocious decision, as they did with Dobbs last summer and many other decisions that they've made. I think that would be the wrong decision, because I think more fundamental than allowing people to practice their own religions is not allowing that practice to discriminate against people because you have one religion, they have something that goes against your religion. You're in a business where your doors are open, and you tell a person, a gay couple who walks in, no, I'm not baking you a cake. No, I'm not putting up this web page for you because my religion says being gay is wrong. If you want to follow that religion, you're entitled to do it, but you're not entitled to use that religion, I would say, to discriminate against someone who's doing something that's just that person's business, no one else's. And, I have a fundamental belief, and this is an opinion too, it's not a fact. I am a strong believer, I've always been a strong believer in that anything is okay between consenting adults. And it's nobody else's business what that is. It's just plain and simply as that. And if you think it should be someone else's business, how would you feel if somebody refused to serve you in a restaurant because they found out that you were engaged in a certain kind of sexual practice and they didn't like it? I mean, I could write a science fiction story about that, and it would probably be, pretty absurd even for a science fiction story. Our society would fall apart if everyone seeking a service in public, whether it's a restaurant, a web page, a bakery, a toy store, a clothing store, whatever, that someone who walks into that store, their personal behavior, which is not hurting anybody else, which they're more than entitled to pursue, somehow they would have to prove that they were engaging in personal behavior that was acceptable to the business owner. That would run completely contrary to the fundamentals, by the way, even of capitalism. I'm surprised sometimes that right-wing people support this. They're the ones who are supposed to be, in favor of laissez-faire. The government, keep your hands off business.
Yeah.
Don't tell business what to do, what not to do. And this is why, by the way, these MAGA right-wing fascist Republicans, and not all Republicans are that, they're not even consistent with traditional Republican conservative views, which I didn't agree with either. But I'm sure William F. Buckley, were he still alive today, and your listeners can look him up, he was a champion of the conservative point of view in the 60s and 70s. He would have been totally against what this baker and web maker are up to, and totally against what the current Supreme Court seems to be on the road to doing.
So, Paul, in conclusion then, and again, I want to make it very clear, and we've had many discussions on, you are a champion of the First Amendment. You are, again, with the Voltairean, I may not agree with what you're saying, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. A powerful statement that has been used many times. But you're also saying that it's not without limits. People use it as a cudgel, if you will, sometimes to beat you over the head. Well, it's my right. It's free speech. Well, in other words, it's not unlimited.
It's not unlimited because there's one thing in this world that's more important than free speech and freedom in general, and that's life. And the reason I think that's the case is if you're dead, if you're killed, then you have no freedoms at all.
Your rights are gone. Your rights are gone.
That's right.
Right to be buried somewhere, maybe.
That's right. So we can never, just logically, rationally, we would never want a society in which we permitted freedoms of whatever sort to result in the death of other people, or even in the injury of other people. I'm not talking about people's feelings. That's something else. If someone gets upset, like, for example, one of the most ridiculous things is to this very day in the Grammy Awards, when you have a rap singer, getting an award and singing, if they say a certain curse word or two, it's bleeped. Why are they doing that? Because they're afraid. Usually it's CBS, that's the network that's on. They bleep those words because they're afraid that some of the viewers will get upset when they hear those words.
They got hammered by fines with the so-called wardrobe malfunction. I worked for them. I remember when it reverberated through the halls there. They used to sanitize everything because they didn't want to get hit with another big fine.
I know, and what cowards they were. And, I think CBS should have been and should still be ashamed of itself for doing that, because nobody is hurt by that. If a person's sensibilities are hurt, don't watch the damn thing, if it bothers you so much to hear those words. But yes, at the same time, we have to be aware of things that cause physical injury and even death. And that's what I think we expect the government to do. Some of the greatest philosophers throughout history said, well, what is the purpose of government? Why do we have a government? And most political philosophers would say, and have said, the purpose of government is to protect the lives of its citizens, not to protect their sensibilities, not to make them feel comfortable, not to ratify whatever discriminatory behavior they may want to practice. Paramount and way above all of that is just the one straightforward thing of protecting the lives of people. And that's why, to get back just for a minute again to Musk, with all of his trumpeting that he is such a great champion of the First Amendment, I was furious to find out a few weeks ago that he is reinstating the totally open atmosphere that Twitter had before. A few years ago, it finally had the sense to tag and delete tweets about the pandemic, which could cause people serious harm and even death. So that's why this man's a champion of the First Amendment. Good for him. But he's also a champion of death if he allows those tweets to once again be prominent on Twitter.
Well, one last thing, I want to play the devil's advocate, because I like playing the devil's advocate. One of the things I'm good at. But you mentioned that in one of the last slides, you said, the urgency of harming someone, or causing someone's death. But you also mentioned it doesn't include hurting someone's feelings. So I want to go back to the Supreme Court case, the cake and the website too. And it's interesting because you mentioned it. We had a discussion about the football coach once who prayed on the sidelines, and you kind of said, well, what's the big deal? Let him pray by himself, etc. Well, playing the devil's advocate, let me say, well, what's the big deal? Find another website. Why must you continue? If she doesn't want to do your business, screw you. I'll go somewhere else. Your final thoughts on that, Paul?
Well, no, that's a good point, but that's why, again, I get back to something maybe that more people can instantly see why it's wrong to do that. Would you or any reasonable person say that a black individual who walked into a bakery and the person behind the counter said, "I'm sorry, I'm not going to serve you. You want to buy a bagel or a cake or whatever, go someplace else"? We would say no, that baker should be put out of business because the baker is discriminating against someone for no reason other than the color of their skin. And what I'm saying is, yeah, that person who's being discriminated against, sure, could go out and find another bakery, but we don't want to live in a society where, for no justifiable reason, any business refuses to serve someone who walks through their doors, or in the case of the web, sends them an email and contacts them.
Paul, as always, I want to thank you for joining us. Your insight is always so helpful. I love having our discussions, and I know how busy you are. I try to follow you. As I said in your intro, singer, songwriter, author, blogger, and professor, Dr. Paul Levinson. Always a pleasure to have you on Being Frank. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Always happy to talk to you, Frank.
And of course, you'll be back. We'll find more. This is not an issue that's going away.